Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives, and I appreciate this privilege to do so, and it's something that I encourage a lot of the members to participate in and express the wishes of their constituents and their opinions here on the floor, so that not only you can turn an ear and listen to this presentation here tonight, but also so that it inspires dialogue all across America. And you will remain a free country, and we can remain a constitutional republic if we have open debate and open dialogue, and if the values of the American people remain consistent with our roots. And I would first, Mr. Speaker, start out with the listening to the dialogue of the gentleman who spoke ahead of me, and I would note that his statement that there are people that went ahead of him and his family that were blue collar seems to me to be maybe a generation removed from the real America, that most of it is blue collar. And I think it's important to note that this country that we are is not going to continue to prosper unless we have people whom we respect and honor, who produce goods and services that have a marketable value both here and home. For those that get paid to pontificate, I among them. Okay, that's an important function also. For those who get paid to sit on the couch, that's not so an important function. But those that produce goods and services that have a marketable value here and abroad are the ones that grow our economies in the private sector, that allow us to be competitive with the countries around the world. And I think of my neighbors who are, many of them, engaged in agriculture, and how we compete with the most competitive economy in the world, and we compete in a favorable way, and we've set the pace. We set the pace in productivity, we set the pace in efficiency, we set the pace in quality and in food safety. That's the circle around my neighborhood that you can see in any direction looking out from my house. And I'm proud of those neighbors who produce those goods and services that have a marketable value here at home. And a lot of that, most of it, is the kind of thing that we would call blue-collar work. And I'm impressed by the professionals that come here to Congress. I came from the construction world, hands-on, in the ditch, shovel in hand, grease gun, wrench, steering wheel, yes, pencil and calculator, from the lowest guy on the totem pole to the guy who started a company to now a second-generation King Construction Company. We've been engaged in this economy for, I believe this would be our 40th season that we're engaged in now. You see the flow of the economy, and you have respect for those who put their hands and their back and their mind to work every day. I appreciate also a great deal these values of America, the roots of who we are as a people. And I was observing this morning, as I was getting ready to leave my place, that there was an individual who was interviewed on Fox this morning in their morning show by Steve Ducey, and it was Mallory Factor, an author whom I happen to know, an individual I count as a friend. And he laid out the 4 principles of conservatism, and I thought it was a useful thing, and I took the notes down and put them in my pocket because I believe he is exactly and succinctly right, that this country needs to be rooted in those principles of conservatism. Without them, we are cast adrift. But here are the 4 principles that he laid out. And the first one is respect for the tradition and wisdom of our past generations. That's a fairly succinct way of saying our founding fathers got it right. They laid down a foundation in faith and free enterprise and fidelity, that the foundation for America becoming the unchallenged greatest nation in the world. And if we're to stay that way, we need to remain respectful to the traditions and wisdom of past generations. Second one is the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, you've heard me speak often and consistently about the rule of law. Lady Justice is often portrayed as blind. The statue of Lady Justice holding the scales of justice, perfectly balanced scales of justice, weighed equally on either side, but Lady Justice being blindfolded because she doesn't see class or race or ethnicity or sex. She sees simply, here's a human being before the court. that's to be treated the same as any other human being, regardless of where they might sit in the social stratification, by wealth, by race, by ethnicity, by sex, whatever the qualities might be, whatever the qualifications might be. Lady Justice is blind, and the rule of law must apply to everyone equally. That's number two. The third one is the belief in an individual freedom and liberty. And I'll go a little further than Mr. Factor in that these rights come from God. Our founding fathers understood and articulated and wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men, and that means men and women in the vernacular, are created equal. And they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The individual belief, the belief in individual freedom and liberty, not a freedom that's granted to you by government, not one that's bestowed upon you by the sovereign or the king, but this God-given individual liberty that comes from God, that we then entrust from the people to the government. We loan our sovereign rights to the government to organize our society. Government doesn't have the power. It's we, the people, that have the power, and we loan that to government. And if it's the other way, if government grants rights, then government can also take those rights away. If that's the case, we would be similar to many of the other governments, many of the other civilizations. We're not. We're the United States of America, founded upon 4 of these conservative principles. All of these principles are conservative principles. The respect for the tradition and wisdom of past generations, the rule of law, the belief in individual freedom and liberty, and the fourth thing is belief in a law higher than man's law. That's God's law. Mr. Speaker, those are the 4 principles of conservatism, and a little tidbit of wisdom that came out this morning, and I took a little note and slipped it in my pocket. I think it's important that we here in this Congress reflect upon those values that made America great and what it's going to take to strengthen those values, restore those values, and carry America to the next level of our destiny. And when this Congress deviates from those principles, when this Congress deviates from the Constitution, when the Congress deviates from individual rights, when the Congress decides that they can tax some people and transfer that wealth to other people and somehow be a leveler or some kind of a wealth transfer that resolves this class envy issue, then America is diminished. Because what it does is it diminishes the vitality of our people. You know, if you get out of bed and go to work every day and you know that Uncle Sam's going to get his share, once the minute you punch that time clock, Uncle Sam's hand comes out. And when he gets what he wants for the day, it goes in his pocket. And then usually the governor's hand comes out and he gets what he wants, he puts it in the pocket. And then you've got some other taxes to pay along the way. And when that's all done, sometime in the afternoon, you get to actually work for yourself and your family. Well, that's a little bit depressing to think that you don't get to work even in the morning. You're at noon. If you go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're reaching your lunch break before you're really actually getting anything for you and your family. Now, what if the government's sitting there taking it all? What if it was, we're going to confiscate all of the money that you earn, and then we'll deal it out to all of these other people, and you'll get your government welfare check just like everybody else. And we're all going to have the same resources to work with. We're all going to have the same amount of food, clothing, shelter, recreation. We're all going to have the same health insurance policy. We're all going to drive an equal value car. But some have to work, and those that don't want to, don't. Think of that. And I've heard that. I've heard that debate on this floor. People will say, from over here on the leftist side of the aisle, they will say, those that want a job should have a job, which implies that those that don't want to work shouldn't have to. And so if they are able-bodied, if they are able-minded, then they should be contributing to this economy or have earned and stored up the wealth to sustain themselves, not tax the other person that's punching that time clock or going to work for that salary. Because what happens is, pretty soon, the one who is being taxed to fund the one who is not working figures out that it doesn't pay so much to work, and it happens in the margins. So people start moving across from one side to the other, and over time, you'll have good, smart, productive people that are smart enough to figure out it doesn't pay for me to do this any longer, and they'll drift over into maybe a part-time job, maybe a little work under the table, maybe some black market stuff, and maybe the rest of that they're just going to tap into some of the 80 different means-tested federal welfare programs that we have in this country and take their standard of living up above might have if all they did was work. That's where this country has gone. The welfare program has grown so great that it's discouraged some of our most productive people. It's a disincentive. So it discourages me that if we're maybe a generation removed, if I'm listening to the gentleman from the Hudson Valley, maybe he's a generation removed from blue collar, I'd like to think that we're always going to need blue collar people. We're always going to need for this country to have a middle class that is growing in numbers and increasing in prosperity in relation to the productivity that they're putting out. And this country is always going to need to compete with the other countries in the world. We can't just collapse down into the idea that we're going to be an economy that has professionals that live in gated communities, that hire servants at a cheap rate, and then they'll have the people that are a diminishing middle class and the unskilled and the low-skilled that'll make a meager wage, always keeping that meager wage down by a refueling of legal and illegal unskilled immigrants coming into this country that can only compete in the low-skilled jobs. The highest level of unemployment that we have, the double-digit unemployment in this country, Mr. Speaker, are the people in the lowest skilled jobs. So how is it that almost every Democrat and a pretty respectable number of Republicans can leap to this conclusion, which is we need more unskilled workers. We need more of these workers to come in because it'll grow the economy. And, well, just because you have somebody, if you bring in 1,000 people, and we know that we're going to have to educate the children especially and the youth, and we're going to have to provide health care, and we'll be providing housing, we'll be providing nutrition, the food, clothing, and shelter, as I said, 1,000 people could come in, and one of them, if one of them does a day's work, that contributes to the GDP, the gross domestic product. So if the day's work of 1 in 1,000 contributes to the GDP, they, by their definition, say the economy's growing. The economy will grow if you have more and more immigration, and they don't say unskilled. Well, we have an opening here for some skilled people to come into this country. We have an oversupply of unskilled. We have 101.4 million Americans of working age who are simply not in the workforce. 101.4 million. That's Bureau of Labor Statistics off of their website, and the numbers total this. Those 16 and up that are of working age, plus those who are on unemployment today, officially signed up on unemployment. Add those two numbers together, 101.4 million. A third of our population is of working age and not in the workforce. And yes, some are retired, and some are handicapped, and some are homemakers, and some of them are in school, but a whole lot of them could actually be recruited to come into the workforce and produce that good or service with marketable value, increase our GDP. And what's the cost to our society for putting more of the people that are 101.4 million that are not in the workforce? What's the cost to our society if we called 10 million in? What if we called 20 million in? What if we brought 30 or 40 million of the 101.4 million in and put them in the workforce? What does that do? Well, a significant percentage of them are on welfare and unemployment. So they're off the welfare and unemployment rolls. That reduces the burden for the taxpayers. And when they go to the workforce, they're in the productive sector of the economy. They take their wage, they pay their own payroll tax. That means they're paying their Social Security and their Medicare and their Medicaid. So we get a twofer. We reduce the welfare rolls, we get more and more taxpayers, we bring Social Security into balance just simply by virtue of more people going to work, and we have less of the deficit in our entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, because they need less of it. That's what happens if you get this country going the right direction. There are a number of ways to do that. You can't do it, Mr. Speaker, with a president who doesn't believe in work, for one thing. And when they learned, according to the CBO score, that Obamacare would cost this economy the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs. In other words, 40 hours a week times, that's 40 hours, not the 30 hours that are in Obamacare, 40 hours a week times 2.5 million workers. That's the reduced amount of productivity that comes because of the disincentives to work that are associated with Obamacare. The equivalent of 2.5 million jobs. What's the administration say? They say, well, that's going to be a good thing because if you're a homemaker, now you get to make more home. If you're an artist, you get to paint more paintings. If you have hobbies, you get to pursue your hobby. And if you're a parent, you get to spend more time with your children. First time, I believe, in the history of this country that a president of the United States and his administration have taken the position that less work was good for America, which just goes to show you human beings have an almost infinite capacity to self-rationalize, Mr. Speaker, and that's what happened with the Obama administration. They have exercised their almost infinite capacity to self-rationalize on piece after piece of this. They move their socialist agenda, and then they self-rationalize their way along the way. And now we're watching as Obamacare has been a mess, it's been a debacle, and we're watching these numbers where the administration says, well, we got 7.1 million people to sign up. 7.1 million people to sign up? That was their goal of 7. Miraculously, they just overshot it just a little bit. What we don't know are how many of those 7.1 million were insured before Obamacare, how many of them decided that they would opt out of their existing policy and into an exchange policy, how many of them lost their insurance because of Obamacare and had no choice if they wanted to but to opt into an exchange on Obamacare. What percentage of the 7.1 million were actually uninsured, without affordable options, and found their way onto an Obamacare exchange and purchased insurance because, and once you go through all that, how many of them were not subsidized? Out of the 7.1 million, what would be the point, Mr. Speaker, if we had... We look at a society that supposedly had 48 million people without their own health insurance policy. Well, I really wasn't alarmed by that, because I don't know where the right comes from to own your own health insurance policy. But we provided health services to everybody in this country, at least that shows up at a minimum, to those that showed up in the emergency room. And so somehow they twisted this around to everybody has a right, everybody needs to own their own health insurance policy. So I stood on this floor about 4 years ago or so, maybe a little more, and made the argument that of the 48 million, when you subtract from that those who are qualify for Medicaid, and from that those who make over $75,000 a year and presumably could buy their own health insurance, those who qualify, those who are unlawfully present in the United States, and you subtract from the 48 million, those who are down to the number of those who are uninsured without affordable options. Your 48 million became 12.1 million, which, by the way, is 4% of our population in the entire healthcare system in the United States. The insurance system and the delivery system is entirely redirected, transformed under Obamacare to try to get at that 4% number. And meanwhile, it looks to me that we're going to have more people uninsured, not less. And by the way, if you want to sign up in the rest of this year, sorry, you're out of luck. You missed the sign-up deadline. Now, except for some narrow conditions, you're not going to be able to get insurance in this country. It is a calamity, Mr. Speaker, and it's one of the calamities. Another one of the calamities in the time that I have remaining is a reflection upon the hearing today that Attorney General Holder came before the House Judiciary Committee. And his testimony comes about once a year before the judiciary. It's our job to have oversight over the Justice Department, and we've done that, of course, for a long, long time. And as each of the members of the panel questioned Attorney General Holder under oath, here is how I reflect upon this. I asked Eric Holder if he still held the position that he did the last time I questioned him, in that the Department of Justice is an independent department that doesn't take directive from the president, and his job is to provide equal justice under the law, generally speaking. And he agreed with that statement, and I think it's the proper way to frame the job of Attorney General. But to argue that the Attorney General is not politically influenced by the President of the United States is a pretty tough argument to make, Mr. Speaker, when you think of this, that I'd take you back to 2008. Now, this was in the last weeks of actually the last months of the Bush administration. Senator Ted Stevens, for 40 years, represented Alaska in the United States Senate. There were charges brought against him that were evaluated and investigated by federal officers, the FBI. And on October 27th, 2008, Senator Ted Stevens was found guilty of these charges of corruption that were brought against him. 8 days later, he lost his election to Senator Begich in Alaska. 8 days later. And in October of the following year, then former Senator Stevens was killed in a tragic plane crash. But here's the news, the modern news, Mr. Speaker. On March 27th of this year, it's announced in a little news story that hardly got any play that at least one of the FBI agents, it's reported in the news that her name is Mary Beth Kepner, has been severely disciplined, that discipline has been imposed for, let me say, violations during the investigation and the prosecution of Senator Ted Stevens. Now, he's dead. He can't speak for himself. He was convicted in a trial that took place and was concluded 8 days before his election. He narrowly lost the election in Alaska. This prosecution, if it was investigated and operated in the fashion that would be reflected when you see the language that Mary Beth Kepner, one of the FBI agents, was severely disciplined, that discipline has been imposed. What is the discipline? What did they do? Do we think that Eric Holder is prosecuting now Mary Beth Kepner for her involvement in the prosecution of Ted Stevens, which may or may not have, but likely did, bring about a change in the election in the United States Senate so that it gave the Senate a 60-vote Democrat majority and they were able to cram through components of Obamacare that they would not have been able to cram through otherwise? This, you would think, would be worthy of at least a comment on the part of Attorney General Eric Holder to look into and see, is it worthy of now investigation and prosecution, or could you at least release a statement as to the acts that she committed, the investigation that you did? If the case is closed, tell us. But when you have FBI agents improperly conducting themselves to the extent that the Holder Justice Department severely disciplined them, you have to wonder if it didn't change the course of history. You have to wonder if the FBI had not conducted themselves in that fashion that brought about the severe discipline, would Ted Stevens have been reelected? Would that have changed the results in the United States Senate? Would we maybe perhaps not be living under Obamacare today if those actions had not taken place inside this Justice Department? And you would think the Attorney General would look into that or at least have a comment. That's number one. Second one would be the very aggressive overreach of the investigation of Aaron Swartz. And that topic is something that brought about his suicide, and there's been much dialogue in this country about that. Another one that I brought up to General Holder is this: the investigation and prosecution of Conrad Barrett. Now, we've all, Mr. Speaker, heard about the knockout game in this country, and it's where youth, generally speaking, will go pick someone and decide, I'm gonna punch them and knock them out on the street, see if I can do it with one punch, and my buddies are going to see me do this. And sometimes it's videotaped, and we see this on television. And the cases that I have seen, and the cases that have been reported, it's almost always black-on-white crime. The knockout game appears to be black-on-white crime. Well, I fought against, as well as Louis Gohmert from Texas did, fought against the hate crimes legislation because that just turns into a tool. And when you punish someone for what you think they think, rather than for the overt act that they commit, you're going into an area of law that allows a lot of discretion on the part of prosecution and may or may not result in more justice. I believe we ought to severely punish the people that are committing the overt acts. But we should not have gone down the road of the hate crimes legislation, because that becomes a tool that can be used to divide people against each other based upon whatever particular minority group that we might be in. Well, you would think with a country full of black-on-white crime in a knockout game, something that's been all over the news for months now, that Eric Holder could find a way, if he wanted to prosecute a hate crime, to pick one of those African-American youth that has gone in there and slugged and punched out someone on the streets targeted because of their difference in race, and prosecuted. If he wanted to prosecute a hate crime, you'd think he could have picked one of those. But instead, the Justice Department picked Conrad Barrett. Conrad Barrett, a white guy who punched an African-American to play his side of the knockout game. If he's guilty of this, of course that's wrong, and he should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. We have states that can prosecute those kind of assault and violent acts. But it strikes me that the others didn't fit the profile of the Holder administration, and so they went after the one example of the white guy and the African-American victim instead of all of the white victims and the African-American alleged perpetrators. That stands out to me. And next one is the prosecution of Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza, who did the movie Obama 2016. Yes, that hurt the administration, brought some things out about where this administration is going, the Obama administration. He's no friend of the administration, but it's alleged that he directed $20,000 through friends that were given to a U.S. Senate campaign in New York. That's alleged. Don't know if it's true. That's the allegations. But it must be true that there are thousands of Americans that have done a similar thing for a lot more money. The Holder Justice Department couldn't find them, but they found Dinesh D'Souza to target for prosecution. They also targeted, with federal prosecution, Governor Bob McDonnell in Virginia, who has 5 former Virginia attorneys general who have vouched for the language of the law and said they believe the Holder Justice Department has stretched the limits of that, and we shall see how that comes out. Governor Chris Christie had a problem with the traffic being closed on a bridge, and it created a national furor. But within a week, the Holder Justice Department was investigating Governor Chris Christie for his use of the funds for the Sandy Relief Fund. Now, how is it that a Holder Justice Department isn't going to look into FBI's transgressions in the Senator Ted Stevens investigation, which brought about, I believe, a change in the result of that Senate election and a change in Obamacare? They're not going to look into the overzealous prosecution of Carmen Ortiz and Aaron Schwartz. They are going to prosecute Conrad Barrett for a hate crime, and they're going to continue to prosecute Dinesh D'Souza. It's just a coincidence that he produced Obama 2016. They're going to continue to prosecute Republican Governor Bob McDonnell and Republican Governor Chris Christie while they let people off the hook like the new Black Panthers in Philadelphia, James Clapper, who contradicted himself under oath. That would be, if proven, a perjury charge. Governor John Corzine, Democrat from New Jersey, $1 billion missing in Global Crossing. We can't find a way to investigate him. Lois Lerner, manipulating the IRS to persecute the president's political enemies, and the investigation has to take place by subpoena and contempt of Congress because the Holder Justice Department has a blind eye because the president has said there's not a smidgen of corruption in the IRS, and exempting entire classes of people from prosecution, like illegal immigrants who haven't committed serious crimes. They're exempt from prosecution and removal. Marijuana, huge companies are exempted, even though it's federal law. DOMA, the Attorney General Holder has refused to defend DOMA before the court. Voter fraud, by the way, instead, they bring action against states like Texas who simply want a voter ID and allege that Texas is imposing a poll tax and that it is a racist plot. That's what we have, Mr. Speaker, in the Justice Department today. It's hard to call it justice. It's going to be hard to take this country to the next level of our destiny if we can't have these values that I had brought out in the beginning, these values of respect for tradition and wisdom of past generations, the rule of law, individual freedom and liberty, and a belief in a law higher than man's law. Those things we must restore in this country if we are to restore the pillars of American exceptionalism. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would appreciate your attention. I'd yield back the balance of my time.